Hello everyone, thank you for taking the time to attend this presentation. I'm Jamie Pont, a PhD student from the University of Kent in the United Kingdom, and today I'm going to talk to you about some research we've carried out on the robustness of current state-of-the-art approaches to detecting ransomware. First, I'm going to give you a quick overview as to what we'll be discussing today. I'm going to start by providing you with some background on the problem we're tackling. I'll be explaining why randomness is relevant in the context of anti-ransomware techniques and how it can potentially help in detecting ransomware behavior. This will lead us on to discussing the actual problem that we focused on in this research. After that, I'll walk you through the experiments that we conducted to highlight this problem, as well as our findings. Finally, I'll talk a bit about some recommendations going forwards, as well as future work and conclusions. So, I just wanted to include this slide to make sure everybody's on the same page with regard to the ransomware threat. I felt it important to highlight a few recent examples of the kind of damage that ransomware is capable of to help show that it is a prominent and often debilitating threat. In fact, it's reported that COVID-19 has even led to an increase in ransomware activity as criminals look to target organisations which are already under significant pressure in the hopes of an increased likelihood of receiving ransom payment. In August this year, Newcastle University in the United Kingdom were hit by the Doppelpaymer ransomware, severely impacting services offered to students and staff. Not only this, but the attackers started to release data that they had stolen from the university in an attempt to push the victims to pay the ransom. In November, Campari Group, an Italian beverage company, were attacked by the Ragnar Locker ransomware variant. Not only this, but more than 2 terabytes of sensitive data was reportedly stolen from the company. The ransom demanded by the attackers was upwards of $15 million, which of course doesn't include the cost in company downtime such as lost business. I've also included an example of ransomware as a service. Slightly different to the previous examples, this is a particularly dangerous trend amongst the cybercriminal economy, in which criminals can sell easy-to-use ransomware kits, which allow people to launch their own ransomware attacks. So this creates a situation where criminals who don't necessarily have the technical knowledge required to launch a ransomware attack are now able to do so at the cost of providing some of their profits to the seller of the kit. The example that I've shown here is called Satan, and you can see just from looking at it that quite a lot of effort has been put in to make the system appear user-friendly and easy to understand. For example, you can clearly define your own ransom demand, as well as add a multiplier which increases the ransom demand over time for a specified number of days. The platform keeps track of statistics such as total number of infections and payments, and there's even a messaging system, which presumably allows customers to communicate with the sellers of the kits. Thankfully, the ever-increasing popularity and sophistication of ransomware attacks has led to an increase in research interest focused on tackling ransomware. Lots of tools and techniques have been, and are being, developed across academia and industry with the intention of the early detection and recovery of ransomware attacks. One particularly popular approach involves behavioral analysis of ransomware samples. Through identifying patterns in ransomware behavior compared to normal user behavior, it's possible to distinguish between the two. This can then be used to build models which attempt to determine whether or not some given input data represents a ransomware attack. In other words, the problem of ransomware detection can be seen as a classification problem. This has led to the development of several features which can be used to identify ransomware behavior, one of which is simply using statistics and randomness tests to identify the presence of random data. We'll look into this in more detail shortly, but the idea is that this helps to identify the potential presence of encryption and thus the possible occurrence of a ransomware attack. As an example of an anti-ransomware tool, we'll look at data-aware defense. In this case, the tool monitors the file system activity of running threads, and it calculates the chi-square value of the data written to the file system. I'll explain shortly why chi-square is relevant in ransomware detection, but for now, if a certain threshold is reached, the process that generated this activity is suspended, effectively blocking the ransomware attack. I will add that many more approaches can be found in the literature, but I wanted to provide this as a nice example. Identifying the processing of random data is a popular method that several anti-ransomware tools look towards. We think the main reasons for this are that these tests are often cheap to implement and run fast, which are favourable attributes to have for a real-time ransomware detection solution which will constantly be running in the background on a user's machine. So, why? Why do several anti-ransomware tools rely on identifying random data as an indication of a ransomware attack? Like we just saw, data-aware defense calculates values for chi-square, but why? Why is this useful? Well, data that has been properly encrypted should appear, at least from a statistical point of view, indistinguishable from random data. Therefore, intuitively, it could be seen as reasonable to reduce the problem of detecting ransomware to the problem of detecting random data. Many tried and tested statistics already exist which can be and are being used to identify randomness, so why not leverage this functionality to help us detect ransomware? For example, it could be possible to monitor write requests made to the file system and calculate various statistics over the written data, such as entropy or the serial correlation coefficient. I'll go into a bit more detail about these statistics shortly, but these values could be compared against a predetermined randomness threshold, and if the threshold is exceeded, then the assumption that a ransomware attack is in progress could be made. But this approach has some significant issues, which we'll look at now. The main problem is that, as you may have guessed, randomness does not always equal malicious encryption. The fact that seemingly random data is present on a system does not necessarily mean that encryption is taking place, and on top of this, even if the source of random data really is encryption, there is no guarantee that this encryption is being carried out by ransomware. For example, a benign application may encrypt network communications for confidentiality. In our research, we wanted to investigate the former of these issues. Certain file types, such as images and compressed data, are known for being highly entropic. As a result, it's common that these kinds of files will appear random when analyzed by randomness tests. If an anti-ransomware solution is based on this approach, clearly there is the potential for a high number of false positives, in this case, non-random data being classified as random, which in this context would result in a false alarm of a ransomware attack. A high number of false positives could lead to users instinctively dismissing attack alerts, putting them at risk of dismissing a true positive, or even turning off the tool and completely removing any protection in place. In addition, other research has shown that it is quite simple to implement encryption in such a way as to evade certain statistical countermeasures altogether, for example by applying base 64 encoding to the encrypted output, which lowers the entropy of the data. We acknowledge that fleshed-out anti-ransomware approaches often combine the use of statistics with other indicators of ransomware behavior, but we feel that the significant reliance on a feature which is so prone to false positives and false negatives in this context is worrying, considering the importance of protecting a user from a ransomware attack. And before moving on, I just want to stress that the problems we are discussing here are not with the underlying statistics themselves. These statistics were not designed with ransomware detection in mind. The issue is with using them in this context. So, our main goal for this research was to investigate the susceptibility of certain statistical tests to false classifications within the context of ransomware detection. To achieve this, we would first collect a large dataset of perfectly benign, yet highly structured data such as images from the wild. After this, we would generate more data by applying various image conversion and compression techniques, and we would calculate various statistics over this data and determine thresholds for these statistics beyond which we would consider data to be sufficiently random. These thresholds would be taken from the literature, where possible, and we would then be able to compare the statistics that we calculated to these thresholds to determine false classification rates. In the next few slides, I will walk you through this in more detail. Firstly, we defined the scope of our data collection. We decided to focus on JPEGs, PNGs, WebP images, compressed data, and encrypted data. This would give us a wide variety of benign yet entropic data to determine false positive rates, as well as a baseline encrypted dataset which could be used to determine false negative rates. Most of our data was collected from GovDocs, a large corpus of around 1 million files which are freely available for research purposes. After downloading the entire JPEG collection, we took the first 15 subdirectories of images, resulting in 1004 JPEGs for our collection. We then used a Firefox add-on which allowed us to download images in bulk to collect 1000 PNG images and 1000 WebP images by searching Google Images using arbitrarily chosen search words such as mountain and hello. Whilst we now had a collection of WebPs from the wild, we also wanted a more controlled representation, so we used the command line utility cwebp to convert our entire JPEG and PNG dataset to WebP at various quality levels, with both lossy and lossless processing. To give you an example, this command would run cwebp at a quality level of 100 on the input file, writing the resultant WebP image to the output file path. By default, cwebp uses lossy compression. We would simply add the lossless tag to use lossless compression instead. After this, we moved on to the compression of other file types. We compress data from two of the GovDocs threads, which are mutually exclusive sets of around 1,000 files each of various formats such as PowerPoints and XML files. We use three compression utilities, gzip, bzip2, and lzma, running each at various compression levels to ensure as diverse a dataset as possible. We also encrypted the same sets of files using AES in CBC mode, using the OpenSSL command line utility. Our rationale is that ransomware typically implements a hybrid crypto system where user data is encrypted using symmetric cryptography, whereas only the symmetric keys are encrypted using asymmetric cryptography. Attackers adopt this model to ensure that user data is encrypted with the speed benefits of symmetric cryptography, whilst retaining the public and private key benefits of asymmetric cryptography. It was also our decision to treat this encrypted data as if it had been encrypted maliciously, in this case by ransomware. We could have instead treated it as data that had been purposefully encrypted by a user themselves, although we chose the former in order to provide an insight into false negatives rather than just false positives. After this, we ran the command line utility ent, a random number testing tool. This enabled us to calculate values for entropy, chi-square, arithmetic mean, Monte Carlo value for pi, and the serial correlation coefficient over our input data. I won't go over the details of each statistic in this talk, however they can be found in our paper, as well as in the wider literature. To the best of our knowledge, only entropy and chi-square have so far been used in ransomware detection. Still, we felt it would be useful to analyse the additional statistics to help determine whether or not it would be worth pursuing them in the future for ransomware detection. In order to evaluate each statistic, we defined thresholds beyond which we would consider data to be classified as random. Unfortunately, most thresholds in use in the literature are not explicitly stated, so where this was the case, we defined our own thresholds based on a 1% margin. The table on the slide shows the exact values we used as our thresholds. For example, an entropy value greater than or equal to 7.99 would be considered as random. Similarly, a Monte Carlo value for pi between 3.11 and 3.17 would also be considered as random, based on the 1% margin either side of 3.14. Values outside of these bounds would be considered as sufficiently non-random, or in this context, not the result of a ransomware attack. I have included a small version of some of our results on this slide, although I don't expect you to read this. The full details can be found in our paper, but I will highlight some of the key results we saw in our experiments now. Firstly, false positive rates were generally unacceptable across the board. We have some occurrences of low false positive rates, for example 0% for chi-square on JPEGs and 0.3% for entropy on JPEGs, but in general, false positive rates were much higher. Taking entropy as an example, we can see that, as I said, there is a case of a 0.3% false positive rate. However, that same statistic frequently obtains false positive rates of over 50% and even up to 83.9% in the case of PNGs converted to WebP using lossy compression at 100% quality. In fact, the worst case we saw was a false positive rate of 92.8%, which was the result of applying arithmetic mean to lossy WebPs, which were converted from PNGs at 100% quality. The graphs here represent the chi-square values calculated over 27,052 images and 55,300 compressed files. The red horizontal line on both graphs represents the value that we used as our chi-square threshold, which in this case was 293.25. We have also added vertical dotted lines to split the graph into the distinct parts of our dataset, such as the different compression types. In addition, the change in colour represents the quality level used for that particular batch. The full legends can be found on GitHub, along with the rest of our code, dataset, and graphs. Hopefully, it's quite visually clear from looking at these graphs that a very big percentage of our dataset falls below the threshold, representing false positives in this context. When looking at the WebPs that we found in the wild, false positive rates were also consistently above 50%, apart from in the case of chi-square, which still had a false positive rate of 45.4%. The WebP format is continuing to grow in popularity and has been shown to fool randomness tests in the past. It's interesting and somewhat expected then to see that the format continues to cause problems in the context of ransomware detection due to the reliance on randomness tests. Clearly, the false positive rates that we are seeing are generally far too high to be appropriate for a real-time ransomware defense solution which is continually running in the background. A user would receive too many false alarms which would likely deter them from using the tool. There is no way of knowing what kind of files the average end user is going to have on their machine, which complicates matters in trying to decide the optimal statistic for detecting ransomware. As our results show, what works well in some cases can equally perform poorly in others. Unfortunately, no single statistic performed well across all of our experiments, meaning we can't recommend a single statistic as the optimal ransomware indicator going forwards. False negatives were not the focus of our work, but we felt it relevant to include an analysis. The best false negative rate we saw was 4.87% when calculating chi-square over the encrypted contents of GovDocs thread 4. The worst case was 24.37% using entropy over thread 5. Whilst these percentages are generally lower than the false positive rates, this doesn't lessen their significance, as the potential impact of a false negative is irreparable data loss for a user. Due to their on average lower false negative and false positive rates, chi-square and serial correlation coefficient show the most potential and therefore deserve the most attention going forwards. We believe that whilst these statistics clearly have the capabilities of providing an indication of a potential ransomware attack, thorough testing in a real end-user environment is needed to ensure that false classification rates are minimal. It's also clear that the sole use of a single statistic to detect ransomware should be avoided. As I've said, these tests are often implemented alongside other indicators of ransomware. However, many of these academic anti-ransomware tools are not available, meaning that we were unable to fairly test their full implementations. We're not recommending that statistics are written off entirely. These statistics are often very lightweight and fast, so it would be great if we could find a way to implement them in such a way that ransomware could be reliably detected. One avenue of future work would be to investigate the optimal combination of these statistics so that instead of relying on one, several are used. This could help to improve false classification rates across the board without adding too much complexity. Some existing implementations also investigate the change in entropy over time for a given file. For example, if a process reads low entropy data from a file, then writes high entropy data to that same file, there's quite a strong chance that the cause of this is encryption. Again, however, this is not a perfect solution. There is nothing guaranteeing that the encryption is malicious, if it is encryption at all. Plus, the change in entropy value could be minimal if the file already contained highly structured data. We also believe that it could be worth exploring the variance, standard deviation, skewness, and kurtosis of a process's file system activity. This would help to gain insight into the consistency of highly random writes to a file system during a ransomware attack. However, we haven't yet tested this idea. So, in summary, we first covered the relevancy of randomness detection within the context of anti-ransomware research, showing that there are several statistics that can be used to help identify a ransomware attack. We then discussed the main issues with this approach, namely that the presence of seemingly random data on a user's machine does not automatically imply that a ransomware attack is underway. We then looked at our data collection process for images, compressed data, and encrypted data, as well as how we used ENT to calculate statistics over this data. We also looked at how we defined thresholds for randomness based on the literature where possible. We showed that false classification rates are far too high, which can result in a situation where a user is plagued by false positive alerts or is impacted by a false negative, and we discussed some ideas for future work, such as combining statistics or looking at the change in values over time. All in all, what we've tried to convey with this work is that while statistical measures could be a valuable feature within a wider, more complex approach to detecting ransomware, we would not recommend using them exclusively, no matter what types of thresholds you establish, as this will lead to unacceptably high false positive rates and false negative rates. Another way of seeing our work is as an encouragement to pursue ransomware detection tools based on more complex behavioral approaches, avoiding the sole use of statistics. As a reminder, our dataset can be found on GitHub. The link is at the bottom of this slide, along with the QR code which will take you there. Thank you very much for listening. I'm happy to take any questions.